who came out again to entertain us and also make us very erudite with her knowledge. If you ran from somewhere to get here, we really appreciate it. And if you need something to eat, we have these energy bars here, so please feel free. And if you missed out on getting handouts, there's handouts here. Now, we're planning to make a recording of Megan giving this presentation. Is there anybody who has any objections to that? Please cry out now. Okay. It's just going to be Megan and the screen. You won't be in the recording at all. Okay, and please, do you want questions throughout or the presentation?
That's a good question. You know what, I think if it's okay with everybody, I'm going to ask you guys to write your questions down if that's okay, and just hold them until the end, and we'll discuss everything at that time.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we do have a genealogy database here. You have to be either a student or a member of the library to have access to it. We do also have an archives here that has information, mainly about the library, about some of the things. Sudi, did you want to come up and just say a couple of words about the archives?
Well, we've been trying to collect the history of the college, what we've been working on the last few years, and we've been really pleased with the items that we have found and that have been donated by a lot of faculty members, mostly, or people with some association to the school. And it's definitely an ongoing process. And if you run across anything, if you ever had classes at Martin, or know someone who taught or was associated with Martin, if they have any kind of memorabilia or any kind of records or whatever, we'd be happy to look at them and most likely take most anything that you might find. And we're located in what was one time the conference room in the library here, and we're very fortunate to have an area where we can try to gather all of our archives for the college. And we have a very special family collection in there as well that we're very honored to have, and we appreciate your family donating that. So since we no longer have the Manning history room that's taken over, well, not taken over, it belonged to Martin County Historical Society, and they moved that back to a location where they were wanting to have it. But we are happy to have anything related to the college or talk about any kind of family histories that you might have.
All right, thank you very much. That's Sudi Reason, who is our archives librarian. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. So first of all, let me thank everybody for being here today. I really do appreciate it. Thank you again to Martin Community College Library, Ms. Bovek and Ms. Reason. I appreciate you guys having me back out here. And also let me say as well, if you do have any family genealogy records and files that you would like to pass on, please do consider donating a copy either here to the college library or to any of the other local historical libraries, or even the North Carolina State Archives, because we do greatly value all of that information, and we will take anything and everything that we can get. So please do keep that in mind. But without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump into our main presentation for tonight. So please write down all the questions that you have. Don't be afraid to ask. I promise I am very friendly and approachable, even though I have a little bit of RBF going on. That's okay. But we're going to go with it. This is what I tell my students, you know, don't be afraid. I know I look a little mean, but that's all right. I'm good. All right, so here's our agenda for today. If you would like to take a picture of this just so that you can keep up with what we're going to be discussing tonight, I'll stop and give you guys a second to do that. You're more than welcome to. So, our first topic for today is going to be an introduction to historic cemeteries. So now, first of all, we need to talk about what exactly makes a cemetery historic, because we can't just put that label on any cemetery, right? So by definition, in North Carolina, the law says that a cemetery is deemed historic if it is 50 plus years old since being established, right? So that's what the law tells us. Now, that term, historic, really only applies to the age of the cemetery, right? Unfortunately, that historic term does not deem or does not give any additional protections or legalities to the cemetery. But the good news is that our North Carolina cemetery laws apply to all the cemeteries in North Carolina. Doesn't matter if they're newer or historic. So they all get the same legal protections, which is great. Now, why should we care? I get that question a lot, right? There are people who will look at a job like this and they will say, you know, well, come 100 years down the road, these cemeteries are going to be deteriorating all over again. What's the point? Why should we care about maintaining and documenting and preserving these historic cemeteries? Here's my answer. Really, it's fourfold. Okay? First of all, these historic cemeteries provide incredibly valuable genealogical and historic information, right? This is not information that we may be able to get from other places, especially if the cemetery has not been documented, right? Which is part of our job, and that's part of what we're going to talk about here today, is how to go about doing that. But we get a lot of information from a headstone or from a cemetery as a whole, and I'm going to tell you what information you can get from that. The second reason is because it's respectful, right? You go out and you clean up a cemetery, you make it presentable, keep the grass cut, keep it well maintained. People can come and visit their loved ones, their ancestors, and then people can also hopefully read the stones, or at least if they know where it is, even if they can't read it, they can still get to it. Okay. The next thing is, it's a community service, right? Oftentimes when we do this kind of thing, it is voluntary. I do have people who will hire me to come out specifically and clean their family cemetery, and it may be located in a remote location, and that's fine, we do that too. But it is a nice community service, just something to volunteer for. Okay? And lastly, this historical information is going to be lost. If we don't document and preserve these cemeteries, all the information that we could possibly get from it over time is going to be gone. And there's no way to get that back once it's gone. Makes sense, right? Okay. Now, let's talk about this question right here. So normally if I'm in class, right, because I'm a teacher full-time, but normally what I would do is I would offer candy because my students are very food-driven. So I would hold up a piece of candy and say, okay, first person to answer this and get it right gets the candy, right? I don't have any candy with me today. I'll give you a protein bar. My question to you is, what is the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard?
One is closest to in a churchyard.
Yes, nice job, thank you, very good. So, yes, a cemetery is kind of an overarching broad term that encompasses pretty much everything. Now, a graveyard is, as you were saying, in attachment to a church or a churchyard. It is somehow connected to the property of a church, and that's the real difference there between those two by definition. But a cemetery could be anything. It could be a graveyard, it could be on public or private property, it may be a small or large cemetery, it could be modern day, it could be historic, it really doesn't matter. So there you go. All right, now, let's talk about some examples of our local historic cemeteries. You guys probably know all about these, or at the very least you've seen them before, you've heard a little bit about them. So first of all, Spring Green Cemetery. Raise your hand, you ever heard of this one? Yeah, figured we were going to get that. So Spring Green Cemetery, of course, is if you are on Highway 903, right, coming out of Robertsonville like you're headed towards Hamilton. It's right there on the corner between Robertsonville and Hamilton across from the church. Yeah. I do believe, if I'm correct in remembering, you can still choose to be buried out there today, I'm pretty sure. But there are a lot of historic graves out there. There are even some missing headstones. There are some graves that had a plaque or a headstone on them, and that is now either deteriorated or just completely gone for one reason or another. Right? But that is a wonderful cemetery to visit, by the way. It's a nice little place here in the Robertsonville area. The next place is going to be Jamesville Primitive Baptist Church Cemetery. Has anybody been out there before? Yeah? What was your experience with that?
It is very old.
Yes, it is.
Extremely old, and, of course, we were searching to hopefully find a connection, and we never did, but it's very peaceful.
Yes, it is.
Very, very peaceful.
Very much so. Thank you for sharing that. So Jamesville Primitive Baptist Church Cemetery, I've been out there a few times. I had a lady a while back who hired me to do some family genealogy for her, and she had a connection to that area. And I was, having to go out to that cemetery to find some information on her family. But that particular cemetery is, like you were saying, incredibly old. So old, in fact, I'm pretty sure it was founded, if I remember correctly, in the early 1700s. Most of the headstones out there are made of slate or wood, which again is something else we're going to be talking about here. But it is in a bit of a state of disrepair. There are some missing stones. There are a lot of headstones that have fallen over or cracked in two or have been buried underneath the mud and the leaf litter. And here in Eastern NC we have these longleaf pine trees everywhere, and so we get this big, big layer of dried out pine needles. And you can even go out there and see that some of the headstones have just been buried under the pine needles, mountains of them. But it is a beautiful, beautiful cemetery, highly recommend. The next one is going to be the Old First Robertsonville Cemetery, which is actually in the picture right here. That is the sign that sits right there at the roadside as you enter. Anybody been out to that one? Yeah? Okay. We've been out there several times. If you don't know, this is my mom and stepdad. They come with me on some of my cemetery hunts and cleaning expeditions and stuff like that because they enjoy this kind of thing too. But we've been out here several times. We've cleaned a lot of the headstones out here. It is also a beautiful old cemetery. This one in particular is kind of set back in the woods. It's off of the side street if you're on Highway 903, like you're headed out of Robertsonville towards Griffin's. Right? And there is a part of this cemetery on the very back side that's actually in the tree line, and it's fenced off, you can tell. But unfortunately, it's so overgrown, even though it's been somewhat maintained, that you can't really effectively get to the headstones that are in that tree line because the thorns and briars and the overgrowth there is just so thick. There are some toppled over headstones in that area that we haven't yet been able to get to for that reason, so we're working on that too. Next one is going to be Skowarki Cemetery, which is right down the road here on the corner. You guys, I'm sure, have seen that a million times before. That one is very well maintained. The headstones have been kept clean. They're mostly readable. It in itself is also a beautiful cemetery as well. A little bit on the smaller side in comparison to some of the others, but that's okay. Next is going to be Lily of the Valley Church Cemetery. If you are coming through Everett's from Williamston on Old 64 and you get to the light in the middle of town and you take a right, go down about maybe a mile, mile and a half, you'll see a very large open cemetery on the right-hand side, and it is across the street from the Lily of the Valley Church right there. And that cemetery in particular is actually not just historic, but it's also a iconically black cemetery in this area. And it needs a lot of repair and documentation as well. We've been out there a few times now. There were a lot of headstones, just a high percentage in general, that had not been documented at all. And then there were some headstones, I think if I remember right, that were set back in the tree line. We couldn't get to those either. They were buried. Some of them also were cracked in two. So it does need a little bit of repair as well. Last but not least, Tice Community Cemetery, which is out towards Griffins Township, or is it Griffin? It's Griffins, right? Yeah, Griffin. Griffins Township. And that one is very well maintained in general, but that is also one of the older cemeteries in the area, and I highly recommend that one as well. All right, so now, unfortunately, that was just a snippet of all the historic cemeteries in this area. There are many, 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 many more. And we're going to talk about what that number is towards the end of the presentation, but just think about that short list and compare it to how many cemeteries you see when you're driving around the county or driving around town, right? Eastern NC is kind of unique in that way. because of our history and because of the way in which we were settled, we have this unique situation of cemeteries being in the middle of fields, by the roadside, behind a house, beside an old tobacco barn, so on and so forth, right? Beside the railroad tracks, yes. And you know, our history and the way that we were settled has a lot to do with that, and that's because back in the 1600s, when we were first a colony, our inlets for the Outer Banks and the barrier islands were very shallow, they were hard to navigate, very windy, and they did not make it easy for those big wooden ships to come in through the inlet without being shipwrecked and beached, right? So that didn't make it easy for North Carolina to have a good import economy for a lot of things, including stone. So a lot of these headstones that you're seeing here in these old historic cemeteries are not from North Carolina. They were actually imported from other nearby states like Virginia and South Carolina, who did have good import economies when they were first established. So all of these slate headstones, the sandstone that you're seeing, limestone, things like that, they're not likely to be from North Carolina. They're probably from the surrounding states. Now, we got to talk about safety first, right? So, if documenting and preserving historic cemeteries is something that you are interested in getting into, this is going to be key. And there's a lot of things to talk about here. First of all, please, please, please stay hydrated, always, right? Water, preferably, is great. If you can't do water, some kind of electrolyte drink, Gatorade, anything like that at all is going to be really, really good, especially on these hot, humid summer days where we're sweating out all of that fluid as fast as we possibly can. Next thing I'm going to say, and I know that sometimes this can be difficult depending on your individual situation, but try not to bring small children. Okay? And the reason that I say that is because I have literally stood and watched as a large headstone fell over without any provocation whatsoever. Just tipped right over in front of me. That happens more often than we know, right? And most of the time we're just not there to see it. So you can imagine what that would be like for an adult, right? God forbid anything happen or somebody get in the wrong way behind that headstone. Imagine what would happen with a child, right? So if you can, try not to bring small children. Charge your phone. Make sure your phone is with you. Okay? Emergencies happen, things happen. Having your phone there with you is going to be a good thing, right? So bring that with you. Please, please, please wear closed-toed shoes. Okay? I think for most people this probably goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. Here in Eastern NC, we have a wide variety of different critters and plants that are constantly trying to hurt us. So closed-toed shoes are obviously going to be best. In addition to that, those monuments and headstones, especially on the bigger side, if they do fall over, you're going to want to be wearing closed-toed shoes. I wear tennis shoes most of the time. I don't think that you really have to invest in a steel-toed boot unless you just want to, or if you already have them, that's great. I would say definitely use those if you're working with a larger, heavier monument for sure. But that's going to keep your feet covered from not just bugs and bug bites, but also snakes, poisonous plants, which we're going to talk about here in just a sec, and then of course any injuries that you might get from a monument. Wear long pants for that exact same reason. Highly recommend jeans. Some socks go with that would be great. Make sure your ankles are covered. In the summer, you're clearly going to have to worry about the bugs and animals most often. You may not have to worry about that quite so much in the late fall, early winter, things like that. But we'll get to that a little bit later. Of course, please bring bug spray and sunscreen. That is going to be essential in the summer hot months. You all know that we have mosquitoes out here that are big enough to pick you up and carry you away. So yes, bug spray, definitely. Watch for holes. Here in Eastern NC we do have a lot of sinkholes. We are kind of prone to that sort of thing. Also graves settle over time. And when a grave settles, oftentimes we don't see that there is now a space or a gap in the dirt underneath the surface. And sometimes it does happen that somebody will step on a sunken area and not realize that there is a hole underneath. Or you might see that there's a small hole on the surface, and what you don't see below is that a sinkhole has been created, right? So just watch where you step, keep in mind, try not to step on any sunken spots if you can help it. Keep your phone on you. And the reason I'm saying this is specifically because it's good to have your phone charged, it's good to have it with you, but how many people have gone off and left your phone in your car? Yeah, so it's probably not going to do you much good if it's in your car and charged, and then all of a sudden something happens and you can't get to it, right? So do what I do, keep it in your back pocket. Keep a self-defense weapon on you, and the reason I'm saying this is because I have been approached a number of times by different people when I've been out doing cemetery work, and my mom can attest to this. Most of the time people are just genuinely curious, they want to know what I'm doing, they want to know how they can help, and that's great. I have no problem with that. I did, however, one time, several months ago, have a guy approach me who was not very happy with what I was doing and did not approve of it, and he made that very clear from the moment he stepped foot on the property. And fortunately, I was not there by myself that day. My mother-in-law was with me, which was great, but if I had been by myself, it would have been a very different situation. So, highly recommend keep something on you, whether you have a carry permit or whether you want to carry mace or any kind of knife of your preference, something to help yourself out if you get into a bad situation. Now, always tell somebody where you're going, okay? Cell phones are great, love them, but they don't always work the way that we want them to, and sometimes we can't get service, right? So before you leave, tell somebody where you're going. That way, if you say, hey, I'm coming back, I'll be home at about 5 o'clock, and then suddenly 7 o'clock rolls around and you're not home, somebody knows where you are, and they'll come looking. Bring a first aid kit, that's always a good idea. Or even if you don't want to get a full first aid kit, Band-Aids, Neosporin, anything of the like, that will help out with bug bites, cuts and abrasions, things like that. Injuries happen, especially when you're doing a very physical job like this. Okay. Watch for poison ivy. You guys already know this. In Eastern NC, pretty much all of NC, we have poison ivy that grows wild like crazy. It's everywhere, right? So if you've never seen officially poison ivy in front of you or you don't know how to identify it, here's a good picture right here. You've probably heard the phrase, leaves of 3, leave it be, right? That's pretty much it. If you see a vine crawling up something or a small bush on the ground and it's got these clusters of serrated leaves of 3, it's probably poison ivy. And when it's first growing, when it's very young, the leaves are actually a nice bright red color, and it makes you want to bend down and pluck it and pick it up because it looks really nice. Don't do it. You will regret it. But some people have a resistance to poison ivy just naturally. That actually is a genetic thing, if you didn't know. And then some people are super duper allergic to it, and that sap is kind of hard to get off. And Mike, if you don't mind, I'm going to put the spotlight on you for just a second. But my stepdad Mike here, he is actually super duper allergic. He's one of those people that, you know, if he gets like a drop of it on him, it's going to cause a pretty bad reaction. So, you know, that reaction is going to vary from person to person. So just keep that in mind.
And we have to keep Kenlock on hand to give him a shot in the behind every time.
Yes, yes. Anyway, so yes, please watch out for the poison ivy and poison oak and all that good stuff. Now, in addition to that, I'm going to say there's another plant you need to watch out for as well, and that's going to be this right here. And I know this is a little bit small, so it's kind of hard to see. Somebody tell me, please, if you can see that. What does that look like? There's another plant here.
Queen Anne.
Yes, Queen Anne's lace. Now, here's the problem with Queen Anne's lace, right? We see it all the time. It grows very popularly in ditches, on roadsides, in creek beds, so on and so forth, right? Queen Anne's lace mimics and looks very, very similar to 4 other plants that look like that. That's a problem, because this plant right here is highly toxic. In fact, that plant is one of the most toxic plants in the whole world. Does anybody know what it is? Hemlock. You got it. Nice job. That is water hemlock, It grows wild here in eastern NC, and it is very, very poisonous. In fact, all parts of it, not just the flowers, but the leaves and the stem as well. Okay? So usually it's only deadly if you ingest it, but the problem there is, even if you don't ingest it, even if you just touch it, it's going to be highly painful and irritating. And if it comes into direct contact with an open wound and it gets contact with your bloodstream, there is a chance that it will be deadly. So please make sure to watch out for that. So Queen Anne's lace is perfectly fine. That right there, if you see a purple, dark red stem going up to it, and it's got these little needle-like hairs all over it, that is specifically hemlock. Don't touch it. Okay? Next thing, wear gloves. Always, always, always wear gloves, and I'm going to tell you why. I went out weeks and weeks ago to a cemetery between here and Beargrass, and I forget the name of it. But I was super duper excited because, you know, I'm that kind of person where I'm in the car and I'm driving and I see a cemetery and I'm like, oh, who's buried there? So I go get out and I go to the cemetery and I'm traipsing around and, you know, wearing my flip-flops like I do year-round. And I go out there and that was red flag number one, right? Like, don't go out to a cemetery that's not been maintained wearing flip-flops. That's just a bad idea. But I got really excited and I saw some of the headstones had fallen over and I said, okay, I'm gonna go, I've got my stuff with me in the car and I'm gonna go try to repair these, right? It shouldn't take very long. So I go out there and I try to do my thing, and dummy me, reach down without any gloves on, rookie mistake, go to pick up one of the broken parts of a headstone, and I look down and I see that there's a baby snake underneath it.
Wow.
Now, fortunately, I know how to identify most of the snakes here in North Carolina, so for me it wasn't an issue. I could immediately tell that this was just a black rat snake. No harm, no foul. He's not going to hurt me. In fact, at first I kind of thought he was a worm because he was so small, but you know, you could tell a worm from a snake. So I put the headstone back, and I said, okay, I'm going to leave you there and I'm going to go the other direction and we'll be okay. Now, if he had bitten me, there wouldn't have been any problem, right? Because we know that black rat snakes are non-venomous. If, however, it had been something like a copperhead or a cottonmouth, we would have been in trouble. Okay? So knowing the difference and how to identify those snakes and spiders of eastern NC is going to be helpful. I'm not going to say that's 100% necessary, but it is going to help. Okay? So obviously, I'm sure everybody in here has probably seen a cottonmouth and a copperhead before. You probably know what they look like. But if you haven't, here's a good picture here. And if you notice, this is a copperhead. And he's got this nice little dark pattern right here, and they look almost like perfect Hershey's Kisses, right? That is how you identify a copperhead. If they've got that nice clean looking copperhead Hershey's Kiss pattern on it, that's how you know. Okay. And the juveniles will have a little bright yellow tail on them as well. So if you run up on a baby, you'll know immediately because they've got a neon yellow tail on them.
And the babies are more venomous.
Well, yeah, now, they're not more venomous, it's just that,
control it.
yes, when they bite, they can't control their venom like an adult can, so they're going to give you everything they've got. And that, of course, is going to be more deadly. Now, don't touch unstable stones, right? So, like I said, I've seen one fall over completely unprovoked before. It happens all the time. If you see an obelisk headstone and you know that it's tilted or it's halfway sitting on the base, don't touch it, right? Because it's not like you're going to be able to do anything with it anyway. And if it does fall over, you can't lift it on your own, and it's better to just stay out of harm's way, let it fall over, or let somebody who has the proper equipment come in and fix it before it falls over. Okay? All right, next thing. Cemetery law. Yes, let's talk about cemetery law a little bit. So, does anybody know these general statutes for cemetery law, just out of curiosity? No? Okay, all right, good. So, first of all, NC General Statute 65101, this one is super important. Entering a privately owned cemetery with permission, that's what this particular law is all about. So, in North Carolina, pretty much everybody, as long as you're not intending to do any harm or destruction, has access to any and all cemeteries with permission. Okay, of course, during daylight hours, because we know that cemeteries close after sundown, right? Now, here's the deal. Generally speaking, these people here on this list have special permissions. Okay? So let's say that there is a cemetery that's out in the middle of a field. This is on a person's private agricultural property, right? Whether there are crops growing there or not. Okay? It's not your property, you should ask for permission. Okay? You should always ask for permission, right? Here's the situation. That landowner, even though you've asked for permission, may say, I'm not giving you that permission. That happens. Now, if that does happen, there's other ways to handle that. Technically speaking, if you have asked permission, the state of North Carolina says that you should be given that permission, provided that you intend no harm to the property or the cemetery. Right? So, descendants of the people buried in that cemetery have access. County, state, or federal personnel for any reason. Genealogists and persons with a special interest like volunteers who may be there to document or clean the cemetery. Okay? So all of those people should be granted permission, especially. Okay? So now let's talk about the second one here, NC General Statute 65-101. This one talks about entering a privately owned cemetery without permission. So let's say you go and you ask and you're denied that entry, right? And that happens for one reason or another. Okay? You can, first of all, and before I get to this first bullet point, I'm going to say, first thing you can do, and probably should do, is quote that first general statute right there to the person very politely, very civilly. Don't get into an argument. Just say, hey, North Carolina state law says that I have to ask permission. I'm asking permission, and I would really like for you to give me that permission, because if you don't, I'm going to have to go and take further actions, right? Some people may decide that that's okay, and they want to take it further because they don't want to give you access to their land, and that's within their right to do that. It is also within your right to take it further if you really want to get into that cemetery for whatever reason. Okay? So, after you've quoted that first statute, if they still say no, you can at that point call the sheriff's office here in Martin County, or whatever county the cemetery is located in, and say, hey, I have a special interest in being here, or I'm a descendant of a person buried here, I'm supposed to be given access, I've asked permission, they're not giving it to me. Can I have somebody come out please and assist me with access to the property? Most of the time the sheriff's office, if they have somebody available, they'll send a deputy out to help you out and try to talk to the property owner, right? And hopefully everything can be resolved in a civil fashion. Sometimes that's not the case, and sometimes, even when a deputy comes out to help out, they still say no, and if that is the case, at that point in time, you can go to the clerk of superior court within that county and submit a petition. 99% of the time, the clerk is going to approve that petition, and I don't think at this point in time I've ever heard of one being denied. So that would be the legal recourse that you have there. So once it gets approved, you call the sheriff's office, say, hey, I'd like to have somebody meet me back out here on the property. Bring that paperwork with you so that you have it to show the person, right? And hopefully everything will go well from that point and you'll be allowed access to the property, right? Now, your access to that property is a direct path to the cemetery and back and nowhere else, just so everybody is aware of that. Okay? But these two statutes protect your right and your ability to access these properties and these cemeteries. So please do keep that in mind. Now, there are some specifications that apply to that general statute, but in all honesty, they're few and far between, and I doubt you're going to run into very many of them, if any. Now, General Statute 14-149 talks about desecration of a grave or a headstone. Now, unfortunately, I did have a case just last year in Jamesville where a gentleman had taken up some of the local historical headstones that were on a private property. They were actually halfway between his backyard and a neighbor's backyard, and he had just decided that he did not want to continue having to mow around them, right? And so instead of having to deal with that, he popped them up out of the ground and chucked them into the Jamesville River. Gone. Don't know who these people were, have no idea if they had all been documented before, don't know where the headstones are at this point in time, just gone. That violates this statute. That is illegal. And if it gets to a certain point, it does actually become a felony. So when it first starts out, it will be a misdemeanor, but if they take it to a certain degree, it will eventually become a felony. And that is a Class H felony. Now that's desecration of any part of a grave without proper permissions, okay? So you either have to have permission from a current living descendant of that person, or you have to have permissions from the County Board of Commissioners. And that's only for very specific reasons. That might be to move a grave so that you can build something, like for a business, for example, or you could even potentially get permission to do something like what he did, so you don't have to continue mowing around it. Most of the time that's going to be denied, but it is a possibility. So if he had taken that to the Board of Commissioners, he could have worked that out potentially with somebody, but he didn't do that. So things like that do happen. I've seen it a lot. All right, now, here are some good numbers to know. So first of all, this is me right up here. That is my number. I do have a 252 number. Okay. And I also have some business cards right up here. I'll hand those out once we get done. If you would like to have one, you're welcome to come up and grab it. Second is going to be Melissa Temo. She is the Historic Cemetery Specialist at the NC State of Office of Archaeology up in Raleigh. She is a wealth of information. I love Melissa. She's great. She handles not just the documentation of cemeteries in the eastern part of the state, but for the entire state of North Carolina, for all three parts. She has a very, very large job, and she is very busy most of the time. Now, I will say, like I said, she's very kind. She is a wealth of information. If you decide to reach out to her via phone, sometimes you may get her on the phone, and that's great, and you can go ahead and talk to her, but if you don't, leave her a voicemail. She will call you back in a few days. It may take her a little bit to get back to you, but she will. If you decide to reach out via email, you can expect it's probably going to be about a week or two before she gets back to you, but again, she will. Martin County Sheriff's Office, of course, that's their number there. Hopefully everybody's got that on file. And then, of course, the General Office of Archaeology for North Carolina. This is the one up in Raleigh. There are actually several offices throughout the state. Some of them specialize in the mountains, some specialize in eastern NC. We do have a special maritime office for the area down in Wilmington and Beaufort and that sort of thing for the discovery of marine-related archaeology items and artifacts. All right, so, and that is the general number for their office overall. Okay, so now we're going to get into the meat of everything. So let's talk about headstone types and materials, and I'm sure this is probably what everybody's really here for. So, first of all, there are lots and lots of different types of headstones and graves, and I'm sure here in Eastern NC, we run the gambit. We've seen pretty much everything, right? So this is just a snippet of some of the ones that you'll see. First of all, we have an obelisk, and on the left here, that picture right there is a really good example of an obelisk headstone. These are the ones that stand up really tall, they're nice and skinny, have a square kind of shape to them. Usually these obelisks only sit on the base, they're not fixed most of the time. Modern day ones are. Usually there will be a steel rod up through the center of it, but older ones, that's not the case. They sit on the base, and that is how they usually end up eventually tipping over or sliding off. So you'll see that quite a bit. The second example here is called a head and shoulders headstone. Now, that's not this second picture here. I'll actually get to that in just a second. But a head and shoulders stone is this third one right here, and it's called head and shoulders because it vaguely looks like the shape of a head and shoulders, right? Simple enough. We have a lot of those in North Carolina as a whole. We've seen them quite a bit. Okay. The next one is going to be what's called pierced. So this pierced style, if you came to my last presentation in June, we talked a little bit about this. You're only going to find this here in North Carolina. There are 67 current day examples of a pierced headstone, and that's what is in this middle picture right here. They are German, specifically. They are from German culture. And you're going to find those at a cemetery up in the Piedmont of North Carolina called Abbott's Creek Primitive Baptist Church Cemetery. It is on the list for historic places for the country, the National Historic Registry. And the cemetery that this comes from is absolutely gorgeous. Wish I had put more pictures in here for you. But it is beautiful, and if you're ever up that way, I highly recommend going to check it out. But you can see this has a very iconic kind of design to it. They are hand carved. Usually they are made of soapstone, which we'll get to in just a second. But yes, quite beautiful. A ledger, okay, so we see a lot of these here in eastern North Carolina. Ledger stones are essentially a long slab big enough to encompass the height of a person that has been buried there that just lays on the top of the ground or is maybe even set into the ground. We see those a lot here in eastern NC, often because early in our development, in our history, we wanted to write more on our graves and on our headstones than we do today. And so a ledger provides a way for us to do that. It gives us more space to carve and to write things, right? Now, today we know that there's an added function of that. It helps to prevent coffins from rising up when we get a lot of flood water from hurricanes and heavy rains. So the benefit of the ledger is actually twofold. The next is going to be a box tomb. And we've seen some of these too. They're not the most common, but we do see a little bit. A box tomb sits above ground. It is a rectangular shape, very simple, has a ledger that sits on top of it, and that's pretty much it. It's just a box tomb that sits above ground. That's all there is to it. Now, like I said, this is just a sampling of all the different types of headstones. There are many, many types of graves and headstones. So, let's talk a little bit about materials. First of all, wood. So in early North Carolina, when we were still a colony, like I was saying earlier, we didn't really have access to stone. We had to import that stone from other places. And if you didn't have the money or the time to do that, what do you use?
Use wood.
You use wood. So if you go out to some of our more historic cemeteries in this area, and in fact there is one down the road here on the outskirts of Williamston, the Lilly Cemetery, you will see that there are old wooden rounded headstones, and they have been whittled down to the point that they're barely sticking out of the ground. You hardly notice them. Many people just step right over them, and you can't read them anymore. They're so weathered that the writing that was on them at one point is no longer there. We have seen some headstones made of wood that have just cracked right down the center for one reason or another, and then developed a hole in the center of it. So now you have one half of it sticking up and the other half sticking up this way, and you've got this big crack down the center. Right? So that happens too. Slate was a common material early in the 16 and 1700s. If you've ever seen slate before, you know that it is very soft kind of stone, and it tends to splinter, especially as it gets older. So if you go to a cemetery and you try to pop a slate headstone up out of the ground, if it has fallen over, you're going to notice that it comes off kind of in sheets, like it's kind of plated, right? And that's just how it naturally forms. But unfortunately, slate does deteriorate quite easily, which is further reason for why we need to go and document these cemeteries, because we do have so many that were made out of slate because of our situation. So, there you go. Next is going to be soapstone. Soapstone is also another soft stone. In fact, this middle one right here, I think I told you guys, is made of soapstone. It made those types of headstones easier to carve by hand. It made it quicker, right? You could do more intricate designs with them, like the ones that you're seeing here. And so, particularly in the Piedmont of North Carolina, you're going to see a lot of soapstone. Marble. Marble was the material of choice in the 1800s. In fact, that's going to be the vast majority of the older headstones that you're going to see at this point in time that have not weathered away and are still standing. And marble is pretty easy to identify. It's much harder, it's much heavier, it is harder to carve, but it was plentiful around that time. It was cheap, it was easy to get, and it was easy to import, which is why people started switching over. Sandstone. Now, unfortunately, I don't have an example up here of sandstone, but we do see a lot of that in eastern NC as well. Sandstone is identified mostly by the feel of it. You can tell if you feel it, it is very rough, kind of like sandpaper. and it is also kind of soft and easy to deteriorate over time. And you'll notice that if you run your hand over the back of it, which I would never recommend, but if you do that, you will notice that parts of the sand actually start to come off, right? So there's that. All right, so let's talk about cleaning. You guys ready for the cleaning? Okay. So here's some do's and don'ts, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about these headstones here. So this first one right here, Miss Perkins Denton, actually is found in the old First Robertsonville Cemetery. So last year I came out and I decided to do some cleaning. The far left picture for her is how it originally started out. It was completely covered in algae, very green, very stained. You know, it had that old headstone look to it, right? So I cleaned it, came back the next week, took another picture, so that's the one in the middle, and then I came back about a month and a half later, and that was the final picture that I took on the right there. And you can see there's obviously a big difference there. So let me tell you about how this works. So this headstone here for Miss Cora is marble, and you can tell that it's marble because it's this nice white color. It's very solid, very sturdy, and it's not soft. If you try to touch it, things are not going to come off of it, right? So do's. First of all, if you're trying to get fungus and lichen off of a stone, use a plastic scraper, right? Because plastic is softer than metal. You're less likely to leave any damage or scratches on the stone if you use plastic versus metal. So my recommendation is going to be use plastic. And you can find those almost anywhere, right? I mean, dollar store, Walmart, Lowe's, you name it. Next, use a soft bristle brush, preferably one that has longer bristles on it. And the reason I say that is because with these softer stones like limestone and soapstone and stuff like that, if you use a stiff bristle brush, you're more likely to leave scrub marks behind on the headstone even after it's done being rinsed and cleaned. And obviously you don't want to do any further damage to the stone. So a long, soft bristle brush is going to be best. And I have one that I use, I love it. Bought it from Walmart for like $5. That's my recommendation. Next is going to be use D2 or wet and forget. And I'm going to address something here because if you are just getting into the cemetery and headstone cleaning community, you're going to find out very quickly that there is a huge controversy about these two particular chemicals, right? Now, there's a lot of people in the cemetery community who would say only use D2, right? And that's fine. If you want to use D2, go for it. It is the gold standard. Highly recommend, right? Nothing wrong with that. The problem with D2 is that it is incredibly expensive. Okay? So you'll get a jug of D2 that you can pick up with this little handle, and you can get that from Lowe's or Walmart. You can buy it online. You can get it from Amazon. Problem with it is it's going to run you about $80 to $90 per jug. Now, wet and forget, for example, and I know everybody's going to say, "Ooh, what's up with that?" Right? But wet and forget, you could go right now to Lowe's or Walmart and pick that up for about $20. So a fourth of the price, right? And so everybody says, okay, so what's the big difference, right? If there's such a difference in price, surely there has to be a reason for that, right? Well, there could be, but the issue is people have actually compared the chemical composition of both of these to each other, and come to find out there's really only one compound difference between the two. So chemically speaking, they're almost identical, and both of them are approved by the National Cemetery Association. The federal government even says that you can use either one of these on veteran headstones, and it will be just fine. So studies are still coming out about both of them, particularly the wet and forget. But from what we know at this point in time, wet and forget is cheaper, is easily accessible in comparison to the other, and they both seem to be perfectly fine for use on headstones. Now, obviously, you want to know what kind of headstone you're going to be cleaning, right? Because not all stone is made the same. So, for example, you probably would not want to clean a soapstone headstone with something like D2 or Wet and Forget because it's made of soapstone, it's very soft, it's going to deteriorate easily. So you don't really need to spray that. All you need is some water and maybe a little scrubbing tool, and then leave it alone. Okay. Now other stones, you can spray it with one of these. You may not even need to scrub it depending on how dirty it is, and you can just walk away from it. Right? Or you can spray it and leave it for a little bit and then come back and put water over it, rinse it off, and it'll be just fine. It depends on what type of stone you're working with and how dirty it is. Next thing I'm going to say is use a gentle water sprayer. You do not need to use a pressure washer. Can't tell you how many times I've gone up to a headstone and I can see the lined grooves from where somebody has used a pressure washer and now that stone is permanently damaged, or even in some cases completely unreadable because somebody didn't know what they were doing. Right? So please, please, please don't use a pressure washer. Get one of those pump sprayers or a little hand sprayer that you can use in your garden. Find those at Walmart or Lowe's for $15, $20. They're not very expensive. Fill it up with plain water. You can use water from your hose in your backyard, or you can get bottled distilled water from the store. It really does not matter. But fill it up, pump it up and spray it and clean it off, and there you go. That's all you need. Okay. Use flags to mark a headstone that's in need of repair or recovery. So part of this presentation we're actually going to talk about finding lost headstones that are no longer there and also repairing broken headstones. Okay? But I just get some of those little red ground flags that you often see utility companies will use. You can find those on Amazon for cheap. They're a dime a dozen. And just mark the spot where you think there may be a headstone or right beside one that needs to be repaired. Use a leaf blower or rake if you need to. Here in Eastern NC we have lots and lots of leaf litter, right? We love to see all the little snakes and creepy crawlies and critters that are up under the leaf litter and all the pine needles. So definitely if you think there might be a headstone there that you're trying to get to, use a leaf blower, use a rake, get rid of it before you start trying to put your hands down in there. Hopefully you'll avoid any injuries or bites from that. Don'ts. Okay, here's some big don'ts. Please don't leave any marks or scratches on headstones, right? Aside from the fact that this is historical and valuable information on this stone, it is also somebody's family, right? Doesn't matter how old it is or how far back it goes. We want to be respectful of that. We don't want to further damage the stone than it may already be, right? So please don't leave any marks. Please do not use bleach, ammonia, or other acidic household cleaners. I've seen a lot of people do that as well. Unfortunately, because bleach and ammonia are very acidic and they are very salt-based, those salts actually get deposited into the porous surface of these headstones and will further deteriorate the stone over time. Again, don't use a pressure washer. But secondly to that, don't seal a stone. Some people will look at a stone like something made of sandstone and they'll say, oh, this needs to be sealed so it doesn't deteriorate anymore, and they think that's the thing to do. Please don't. And the reason we say that is because all stones need to breathe, right? And if they can't breathe, they're going to deteriorate even faster. Moisture gets trapped, chemicals get trapped, and then all of a sudden we end up with a headstone that we can't read. Don't use power tools. I've seen this as well. This one's a little bit less common, but I have walked up to a headstone before and seen the iconic round scrubbing marks from where somebody used a drill or a cleaning brush that they just, clicked on and did that. So please don't do that. And don't use anything with wire. If you've got like a wire bristle brush, definitely don't use that. All right, let's talk about reading old unreadable stones for a little bit. So first of all, obviously, clean the stone gently if you need to. If it looks like this one right here, can't read that one, couldn't tell you what it says. It's so covered in algae, it's not even funny. And that most of the ones that you're going to find underneath trees are going to look like that over time. You get pine tar, tree sap, pollen, algae, fungus, all sorts of things that collect over time. But clean the stone. If that still does not work, use something called the mirror trick. Okay? Go to the dollar store, get you a $2 little handheld mirror, reflect the sun from the mirror onto the stone, and that will help you read the stone. Okay? Now, alternatively, if you don't want to go get a mirror and do that, you could go the easy route and just use a flashlight. Does the same thing. Bring a flashlight with you. Use the foiling method if that still doesn't work. Sometimes the lettering on a headstone is so shallow and deteriorated that even a flashlight or a mirror is not going to help, right? So you can use the foiling method, which is basically where you take some very thin, cheap aluminum foil, okay, wrap it around the headstone, make sure you get it good and covered. The foil is not going to hurt the headstone at all, so you don't have to worry about that. Take a soft cloth, kind of like the microfiber cloths that you might use on a car, and just take your finger and kind of gently rub over that foil where the lettering might be and see what pops out, and then take a picture. And there you go. Sometimes that does work. I have had that work in favor, or rather in lieu of not being able to read it with a flashlight. Also, read headstones in morning light. So it has been shown that morning light often is going to be better for this kind of thing than reading it in the afternoon, just because of the way the light waves work versus, morning versus afternoon. Next, please, please, please do not, and I know this is the thing that everybody used to do, right? Please don't use shaving cream, flour, chalk, charcoal, anything like that, crayons, wax. Those used to be the ways that we would read a headstone, right? And everybody used to do rubbings. Some people still do. The problem with that is when you use these types of materials, they leave deposits again in the stone and further deteriorate it. And I have seen a lot of headstones where somebody has gone and put flour or shaving cream or chalk over it so that they can read it, and then they don't clean it off and it gets left behind. And so now we have this permanent white outline over the stone that's not supposed to be there, right? So please don't do that. Rubbings, again, if you're using charcoal or wax or anything like that, we don't want to put that on the stone, so please try to avoid that. Also, don't use a pocket knife or any kind of sharp utensil to clean out the lettering on a stone, because obviously that's going to leave scratches and damage behind, and we don't want to do that. If you are trying to get the algae and buildup out of the lettering, you can buy these cheap little hooked plastic items. They're kind of like, they have a brush on one end and a little non-sharp hook on the other. You can get them on Amazon. I think I got mine for like $8. But those are not going to leave marks behind when you go to clean out the lettering. So I highly recommend those. All right, I think that's it for those. Okay, permissions and ethics. Let's talk about that real quick. So first of all, I think I said this before, but always get permission if possible. So when you're going out to a cemetery to do cleaning and documentation, especially if it's on private property, you want to get the landowner's permission first, obviously, right? Now, we already said, if not possible, cite the statute. If that doesn't work, call the local sheriff's office. And if that still doesn't work, submit a petition to the clerk of Superior Court. You want to make sure you do that for the county in which that cemetery resides. Always do your research on the cemetery before going. You want to know who's buried there, how old the stones are, what they're made out of, what kind of environment you're walking into, right? Because I don't care what time of year it is here in North Carolina, you never know what you're going to walk up on when you're going into an old cemetery, right? Could be anything. Okay. Always be respectful, of course. And remember that this is somebody else's family, and you want to treat that with the utmost respect for that reason, if none other. Okay. Also keep the local religions and belief systems in mind, graves, and that is their decision, and if they don't want that, that's fine. And I will say, okay, well, thank you for telling me. I'll move on to the next one. And that's it. All right, let's talk a little bit about finding lost headstones. Now, this is really my bread and butter. I love finding lost headstones.